So change in the money supply is this. So if we have to come back to equilibrium, then this has to be equal to this. Pretty simple. Just see the simplicity of this. And this has to be equal to partly the adjustment in the demand for money will come from change in income. Partly it will come from change in the rate of interest, right? Okay. So now, of course, if we are talking about the monetary policy multiplier, what is it giving us? That if money supply changes by a certain amount, we are keeping the prices fixed, right? Fixed price amount. So the change in the real balance has to come from the change in the nominal balance. Okay. This is also good math for real money, right? Liquidity. Now, income gets determined in the goods multiplier. And when we are talking about the monetary policy multiplier, basically what we are saying that if we change the money supply by a certain amount, by how is the income going to change? By what multiple of the initial change in the, say, money supply is going to affect the income. Alright. So, and how is it going to affect the income? By affecting the aggregate demand. And by how much the aggregate demand will change? Okay, initially, why should the aggregate demand change to begin with? No change in the government expenditure. We are not talking about fiscal policy multiplier. So where, if the income has to change, there has to be some initial change in the aggregate demand. Where is it going to come from? No, it is going to come from changing investment, not consumption. Initial change has to come from the investment. Because rate of interest is going to change. And we have not assumed, one can incorporate, rate of interest in the consumption function also. We can do that. Absolutely no problem with that. Alright, the only thing is that it becomes a little more complicated than it already is. Alright, but then since we have not made consumption to be dependent on the rate of interest, consumption is not going to change initially. Consumption will change in our model if and only if the income changes. But mind you, income is not changing when the money supply is changing initially. The only thing that changes is the rate of interest. Right? Okay. Now, by how much is it changing? I missed out on one particular thing. Okay. Alright, let me just please remind me about the fiscal policy thing that we talk about the slope of the ice curve and okay, I'll come back to that later. Okay, by how much is it going to shift here? The horizontal shift. This has to be equal to this, right? Now, if you're talking about this, then delta I is 0. If you're talking about the horizontal shift, rate of interest remains the same, right? K. Okay. So, now, and how much this will change? It will be 1 upon K here. So this shift is 1 upon K times. Okay. So greater is the size of K, smaller will be the shift. Why? I'm sorry. Of course, this is a simple interaction. I'm very infamous amongst my students for asking, every 2 sentences, I say, why? Right? Okay. So why is that so? That if the size of K is greater, the shift will be smaller. Take marks. It's very clear from here that 1 upon K delta M by P. So if K is greater than 1 by K, it will be smaller. So 1 by K into delta M by P will be smaller. That's obvious from mathematics, right? What's the economics?
The K is larger means that there is more demand for money.
More demand for money means? If K is larger, K represents what? The sensitiveness of demand for money to any given change in income. Let's say supply of money has to change by a certain amount, right? Now the demand for money has to change. Now the change in this case, if we're talking about a horizontal shift, cannot come from say changing the rate of interest, right? Because we're talking about the horizontal shift, so rate of interest is the same. So the entire change has to come from the change in income, right? Now, by how much the income has to change to give us the required increase in the demand for money, so that the demand for money is equal to the supply of money again, depends on K. If K is very great, a very small change in income will give us the required increase in the demand for money. And we'll be going back to equilibrium again in the money market. Money market, demand for money has increased by a certain amount. Supply of money has increased by a certain amount, right? So we need the demand for money also to increase by the same amount to give us the equilibrium. The change, the increase in the demand for money has to come from the change in income. So by how much the income needs to change? By how much does it change? Is dependent on the size of K. If K is greater, a very small change in income will give us the same change as the supply of money. So we'll be coming back to equilibrium. So if K is larger, the change in income has to be smaller. So the horizontal shift has to be smaller. The horizontal shifts represent the change in income. Right? Are you getting this? Okay. So if K is greater, the shift will be smaller. And by how much the LM curve will shift vertically? You see, it's right in front of you. Same logic. The vertical shift. Very good one.
So our y is constant here and
yes,
y not a constant, like income will stay the same. That's what we are
oh yes,
saying.
yes.
Interest rate is changing. So
if you're talking about the vertical shift, naturally you are saying that income is not changing.
So similar to how we got it when we assume delta y to be, here we assume delta y to be 0.
Right, exactly.
And then we
So how much is that? Okay, I have eyes at my back of my head also, so I can see that. It's 1 upon h delta I. Right? Delta I will be 1 upon h delta m by p. Okay, so this is 1 upon h delta m by p. Now, if h is greater, yes.
Is it 1 upon this minus? What about this sign, sir? Minus h delta.
Oh yes, it will be just in the opposite direction, right?
Yes.
Because if, you see, that's obvious. We were talking about the absolute shift, the magnitude of the shift. So delta I will have to be minus 1 upon h. This is say an increase in the supply of money, but the rate of interest will have to fall. So minus sign here captures that, right? Because this has to be negative. That means the rate of interest has to fall. Is it right? And by how much? 1 upon h. So if the size of h is greater, a very small change in the rate of interest will give us a requisite increase in the demand for money. The same logic, right? Actually, this shift is more important to my mind. The vertical shift. Why? Because the adjustment in the money market takes place through a change in the rate of interest. So when supply of money changes, we move from this point to this point immediately. Not from here to say here. We move from this point to this point because the initial adjustment takes place in the money market. It always does. Whether we are talking about the fiscal policy or the monetary policy, the initial adjustment. In case of fiscal policy, initial adjustment comes from the change in government expenditure, change in aggregate demand, change in slight change in income equal to the delta G1. But after that, the change comes from say the rate of interest and consumption also. But here, the adjustment will straight away come from here, the change in the rate of interest. So we move from this point to this point. And by how much is it going to change? Initially, 1 upon h delta m by 2. Alright. Now, okay. So delta I, by how much is it going to change? K by, yes. H delta I is equal to K delta Y minus delta M by D. So let's remove this from here. Right? Okay. So rate of interest is going to change by this much. Okay. And we know that the adjustment in the goods market will be through what? Rate of interest before. So initial change in investment, change in aggregate value will come from change in investment. Now, is it going to be for an expansionary fiscal policy? Is it going to be positive or negative? Delta, the change in investment. Is it going to be positive or yes or negative? Positive, because rate of interest is falling, so investment will increase. So this is going to be positive. And if this is going to be positive, aggregate value will be increasing. If aggregate value increases, then consumption increase, income will increase, and therefore consumption will increase. So in monetary policy, both of them are going to be positive. Of course, delta G1 is not there. We are not talking about fiscal policy. So these are the two things that will change for the aggregate value, right? And how much is this? This is as usual minus d delta I plus c into 1 minus t delta y. So this is the initial change. This is the induced change. Right? And this total change in aggregate value has to be equal to the change in aggregate supply, that is change in income. Is it not? Alright. So delta y minus c into 1 minus t delta y, and that will be equal to minus b. Fine. We are using the same logic, right? This will come down, so that is nothing but alpha g. So minus alpha g b delta. Absolutely fine. Right. Now, okay, I have omitted that. How much was the delta I?
Minus 1.
Okay. Yes, minus. Okay.
Minus 1 by
You see, the unfortunate thing is that I don't remember the data everything, right? Okay. 1 minus 1 by h delta I delta
k by h.
This is easier for me anyway. Alright, so k by h delta y minus 1 by h delta m by d. It's easy, right? It's all there in your head. So, okay. So this is delta to change by this much. So this is minus, alright, so we can straight away write this here. So since, we have a minus sign here, so if you bring it to, that has delta y in it. So if you bring it to the left hand side, so this will become plus alpha g b k by h delta y. Right?
Yes, sir.
We have taken everything into account, alpha g b k by h delta y, and this will be equal to now, this will be plus now. So 1 by h, okay, alpha g b by h delta. Is it? Take multiply this also here, and this will be plus. Absolutely fine. I hope we are not committed any mistake here. So, if we take delta y common, we're left with this. Now let me write it alpha g b by h. We are almost there. Delta y is equal to alpha g upon 1 plus alpha g b k h into b by h delta m by b. Now this is nothing but gamma, right? The physical policy multiplier. So gamma b by h delta. This is what? So besides the gamma, we also have b by h. So that is the monetary policy multiplier. So you see, once we have that approach, you can derive it using the economics knowledge. It's absolutely fabulous. Not that because I do it, but actually it tells you the economics. We have been using the economics to explain. We are not simply saying this is the highest equation, this is the left equation, put this in this, and then differentiate ultimately. We are saying, alright, what will happen if we change the money supply? So if we change the money supply, rate of interest will change. Alright, and if rate of interest is going to change, investment is going to change. If investment is going to change, consumption will change. So aggregate demand will change, so income will change. Right? So now, because money supply is changing, two things will happen. Rate of interest will increase and income will increase, and therefore the demand for money will change because of both. So you see, finally, this was what? This was the immediate fall in the rate of interest. But the rate of interest is not going to fall by this much ultimately. Why? Why did it fall in the first place? Because we needed the demand for money to increase by the same amount as the supply of money had increased. But now, since the income is also changing, the demand for money may increase because of that also. So now the change in the money supply has to be equal to the change in the demand for money, and this is taking place because of both these. Rate of interest, change in income. This took place when the income had not changed. Now, since the demand for money had increased by some amount because of the change in the income, now this has to be a lesser fall, there has to be a lesser fall in the smaller fall in the rate of interest, because we don't need the entire adjustment to a change in the rate of interest only. So ultimately, the rate of interest is going to not decrease by this much, and this is beta times delta. Okay. Again, the question of all these coefficients, alpha g, b, k, and h. Alright. Now, I can, the thing that Ali had sent you on your mobile phones gives you this also. By rewriting this, we can again, mathematically speaking, we can again say unambiguously, without any confusion, the effect of alpha g, b, k, and h on the size of beta. The the monetary policy multiplier. Let's straight away, that's there in your form, let's straight away discuss the economics of all these coefficients. And maybe then we can call it a day, because I have already taxed you so much. Okay, K, the size of K, what do you expect? Now you have to tell me about the impact of K, H, B and alpha G on the size of the monetary policy multiplier. So we must ask this question that when is income going to change by a greater amount? When the aggregate demand is changing by a greater amount. Aggregate demand is changing because of two things. C, consumption and investment. K affects the rate of interest, which in turn does not affect consumption. So we have to consider the relationship between K, change in the rate of interest, and the change in investment. See, the logic, common sense. It's all about common sense. When I teach economics, it's all about common sense. Nothing else. And that's what we have done today. Because if you're focusing on economics, you're focusing on common sense. Income, if it has to change, aggregate demand has to change. In this case, the aggregate demand will be changing because of either consumption or investment. We are talking about the effect of K on the size of the change in income. Therefore, the change in the aggregate demand. K affects the rate of interest. Rate of interest affects only the investment in our model. We can make consumption to depend on rate of interest. So, K, rate of interest, and investment, and then income. You see, if K is larger, then greater adjustment in the demand for money will come from changing income. If income changes by a small amount, even then the demand for money will increase by a greater amount. And therefore the required decrease in the rate of interest will be smaller. Is it not? Rate of interest, why is it follow? To give us a required increase in the demand for money, so as to be equal to the change in the supply of money, increase in the supply of money. So if K is greater adjustment in the small amount. And if investment is going to increase by a small amount, the aggregate demand will increase by a small amount, and therefore the income will increase by a small amount. Pretty simple. So you have to focus on what you are trying to derive. So we were trying to look at the impact of the size of K on the change in income. We knew that income changes because of change in aggregate demand. We also knew that K can only affect the change in the rate of interest, not C and T, alpha G. And rate of change in the rate of interest only affects investment. So you have to relate K and delta I via delta change in rate of interest. Right? So then you have to see that by how much rate of interest will change if size of K is greater. So if K was greater, the increase in the demand for money, even for a slight increase in income, will be very large. So demand for money has already increased by a certain amount, right? Because of the increased size of K. So the required decrease in the rate of interest becomes smaller. So rate of interest falls by a small amount, and therefore investment increases by a small amount, and demand increases by a small amount, income increases by a small amount, effectively meaning that monetary policy will not be very effective if K is large. H. That's also the same.
Small interest change is needed
if H is larger, then rate of interest needs to change by a very small amount. So rate of interest, change in the rate of interest is in the downward direction. Rate of interest is falling. So if H is larger, the required decrease in the rate of interest is smaller. Change in investment, now that is what I wanted, to put you on the right path so that you can think on your own and move forward. Alright, so in this case, of course, the required decrease in the rate of interest will be smaller, increase in investment will be smaller, decrease in aggregate demand, and therefore the income will be smaller, making the monetary policy less effective. B. Given the change in the rate of interest, by how much the investment will change is dependent on the size of the B. So whatever be the change in the rate of interest, if B is greater, the increase in investment will be greater, increase in aggregate demand will be greater, increase in income will be greater. So monetary policy multiplier will be large because change in income is greater. So B is monetary policy, very simple. Alpha G is pretty simple. Consumption is increasing, greater is alpha G, greater is the induced change in consumption, greater is the total change in aggregate demand, greater is the total change in the income. So greater is alpha G, greater is the size of the